God is dead, and we have killed him. Few words in philosophy have been as shocking or as misunderstood as these. When Friedrich Nietzsche wrote them in the 19th century, he was not laughing at faith, nor was he simply celebrating atheism. He was announcing a crisis that would tear through the modern world, the death of absolute meaning. But before we can grasp what Nietzsche meant, we must confront a more haunting question. Who was the man behind these words? Was he a genius prophet of modernity, or a mind shattered by madness? Nietzsche's life reads like a tragedy of brilliance. Born in 1844, he was a child prodigy who mastered classical languages before most children could even write. By his mid-20s, he was a professor at one of Europe's most prestigious universities. His lectures were dazzling. His mind seemed unstoppable. And yet Nietzsche's entire life was a battle against pain. He suffered from migraines so intense that he often collapsed in agony. His eyesight began to fail, forcing him to write in fragments and aphorisms. His health deteriorated so rapidly that he was forced to resign from academia before the age of 35. But perhaps the most haunting chapter of Nietzsche's life was its end. In 1889, on the streets of Turin, Nietzsche collapsed in madness. Legend tells us that he broke down upon witnessing a horse being beaten, throwing his arms around the animal in tears. From that day until his death 11 years later, he lived in a state of silence, his mind consumed by insanity. And here lies the paradox. A man whose ideas shook the very foundations of philosophy, who declared the death of God and envisioned the rise of a new humanity, spent his final years incapable of speaking, writing, or even thinking clearly. But maybe this paradox is the key to understanding him. For Nietzsche was not a philosopher of comfort. He was a philosopher of fire. He embraced chaos, suffering, and contradiction as the raw materials of life. His philosophy was not a set of answers, it was a challenge. So let us begin. In this journey we will explore not only Nietzsche's words, but the storms that gave birth to them. Raum, the shocking claim that God is dead. The terrifying abyss of nihilism. The daring vision of the Übermensch, the Overman. The eternal recurrence, in which time itself becomes a prison or a test of strength. And the principle of Amor Fati, the love of one's fate. Each idea is both exhilarating and dangerous. Each idea has been twisted, misused, and misunderstood. But together they form a vision of life that refuses to hide from pain, contradiction, and chaos. And so we begin, not with comfort, but with provocation. Because Nietzsche would want nothing less. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. When Nietzsche declared these words in The Gay Science, he was not speaking about a literal deity lying in a grave. He was speaking about something deeper. The collapse of the absolute foundations of meaning. For centuries, Western civilization had built its morality, its truth, and its order on the idea of God. Whether through Christianity, tradition, or metaphysics, life had a center. There was a story, a purpose, a guiding light. But by the 19th century, science, reason, and modernity had eroded that foundation. Nietzsche's insight was not that people stopped believing in God. It was that even those who said they no longer believed still lived as if the old values were intact. The body of God was gone, but his shadow still lingered. And Nietzsche asked, what happens when that shadow fades too? Here is the terror. Without God, without a transcendent foundation, what anchors truth? What grounds morality? What gives life meaning? Nietzsche called this abyss nihilism. The recognition that life, stripped of divine or absolute purpose, might be meaningless. And for Nietzsche, this was not a distant threat. It was the crisis already unfolding in the modern age. The nihilist looks at the world and sees nothing but emptiness. The words good and evil lose their power. Progress, morality, even truth itself appear as illusions. But Nietzsche's brilliance was not simply in diagnosing this crisis. It was in refusing to look away. He writes, nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? This guest is not an intruder we can ignore. It is already here, and Nietzsche warns, if we do not confront nihilism, it will consume us. Societies will turn to comfort, to distraction, to conformity. People will grasp at ideologies that promise safety, whether in nationalism, consumerism, or blind obedience. Nietzsche saw this danger everywhere. Without a higher purpose, people might embrace what he called the last man. This last man is not heroic, not creative, not daring. He avoids pain, avoids risk, avoids meaning. He lives small, safe, and shallow. He says we have invented happiness. But in truth, he has abandoned the struggle that gives life depth. For Nietzsche, this was worse than despair. Better to suffer greatly and wrestle with truth than to live as the last man, comfortable but empty. This is why the death of God is not only a tragedy, it is also an opportunity. Nietzsche believed that the collapse of old values creates a terrifying freedom, the freedom to build new ones. Without God, humans must become creators of meaning themselves. But here lies the challenge: to face nihilism without running back to comforting illusions. To stand in the abyss and say, yes, life has no given meaning, and yet I will give it meaning. This is the fire at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. He forces us to look into the void, not to despair, but to dare, to create, to affirm life even when its foundations tremble. So when Nietzsche writes God is dead, he is not whispering a quiet atheism, he is sounding an alarm. He is saying, the old world is gone, and what we build next will determine whether humanity rises or collapses. If the death of God leaves us staring into the abyss of meaninglessness, Nietzsche does not want us to collapse in despair. Instead, he throws down a challenge. Can humanity create new values, greater than any we have known before? This is where we meet one of his most famous and most misunderstood ideas, the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presents the Overman as the answer to nihilism. If the old foundations of morality have crumbled, then the task is not to cling to the ruins, but to build something higher. The Overman is not a superhuman in the sense of comic book heroes. He is not faster, stronger, or more powerful in a physical sense. Instead, he is spiritually stronger. He dares to create his own values. Nietzsche describes humanity as a bridge, something between the animal and the Overman. And a bridge, by its very nature, is not the destination. It is something to be crossed. Humanity, then, is not the end point of evolution. It is a transition, a possibility, a challenge. But what does it mean to live as an Overman? It means to refuse the safe illusions of the last man. The last man avoids suffering, risk, and depth. He chooses comfort over greatness. But the Overman embraces struggle. He sees pain as fuel. He understands that only through fire is character forged. Nietzsche puts it provocatively. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. The greatness of humanity lies in its incompleteness, in its potential to create, to transcend, to become more. This is not easy. To become an Overman requires the courage to question everything inherited. Religion, morality, culture, all are tested in the fire of creation. It requires the strength to stand alone, to endure misunderstanding, even to embrace solitude. But Nietzsche believed that without such courage, humanity would sink into mediocrity. We would become the last men, satisfied with comfort, but empty of spirit. The Overman is the antidote to nihilism. He is not a passive victim of a meaningless world. He is an artist of life. He does not ask, what is the meaning of life? He declares, I will give life meaning. Philosophically, this is both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring, because it suggests we are not bound by the ruins of tradition. Terrifying, because it places the burden on us. If there is no God, no eternal law, then nothing protects us from failure, from chaos, from despair, except our own strength. Nietzsche's Zarathustra describes the Overman as a lightning bolt, a storm, a destructive force that clears the old to make room for the new. But destruction is only half the story. Creation is the other half. And the Overman's greatest act is not tearing down, but building up. Today, the idea of the Overman has been twisted. Some have seen it as a justification for domination, for elitism, even for fascism. But Nietzsche's vision was not about political power. It was about inner transformation, about the individual who refuses to live as a shadow of inherited values. The Overman is not above others. He is beyond himself. He is the one who dares to say, yes, life is chaos, but I will dance with it. And here lies the question for us. Are we willing to become bridges, not destinations? Are we willing to embrace pain, risk, and creation, rather than cling to the shallow safety of the last man? Because for Nietzsche, the future of humanity depends on our answer. For Nietzsche, suffering was not a curse to be avoided. It was the raw material of greatness. In a world obsessed with comfort, security, and ease, Nietzsche dared to say, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." This statement is more than a motivational slogan. It is the essence of his philosophy. Nietzsche believed that suffering is not merely an obstacle. It is the very condition of growth. He saw modern culture trying to escape pain. Religion promises paradise beyond suffering. Science promises cures and solutions. Society promises convenience and distraction. But Nietzsche asks, if we remove all struggle, do we not also remove the chance to become truly strong? Here we arrive at one of his most provocative ideas, the will to power. Nietzsche suggested that the fundamental drive of life is not survival, not pleasure, not even happiness, but power. Not political power or domination, but the deeper power to expand, to create, to overcome. Every living being, he argued, strives not simply to exist, but to grow, to shape, to transform. Think of a tree. It does not simply survive at its height. It pushes upward toward the sun, downward with its roots, outward with its branches. It strives, it struggles, it overcomes resistance. That, for Nietzsche, is the will to power in action. For humans, this manifests in countless ways. In art, when the artist wrestles with chaos to bring beauty into form. In science, when the thinker breaks boundaries to discover new truths. In morality, when the individual dares to create values that challenge tradition. Suffering, then, is not a barrier to this will to power, it is its fuel. Without struggle, there is no overcoming. Without resistance, there is no strength. Nietzsche asks us, would you remove the fire that tempers the steel if it also removed the steel itself? And yet, modern life tempts us with shortcuts. Painkillers, entertainments, ideologies, all ways of numbing the harshness of existence. Nietzsche feared this path leads not to greatness, but to weakness. A society that flees suffering creates individuals who cannot endure truth. This is why he mocked those who saw life only as comfort. He wanted us to embrace life in its totality, the joy and the agony, the triumph and the disaster. He even wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." Here lies Nietzsche's challenge. Do we dare to see suffering not as punishment, but as possibility? Do we dare to love our struggles as the very things that make us more? Because in Nietzsche's world, the strong are not those who avoid pain, but those who transform it. They turn wounds into wisdom, chaos into creation, suffering into strength. The will to power is not a command to dominate others. It is the demand to dominate oneself, to take the chaos within and forge it into something higher, to accept that life's harshest trials may be its greatest gifts. In this way, Nietzsche forces us to ask, are we becoming stronger, or are we numbing ourselves into weakness? Great thinkers are often betrayed not by their enemies, but by their admirers. And perhaps no philosopher has been more profoundly misinterpreted than Friedrich Nietzsche. In the decades after his death, Nietzsche's words were twisted, edited, and weaponized, until his philosophy was invoked by one of history's darkest regimes, Nazi Germany. The Nazis seized on certain phrases, will to power, Übermensch, and the death of God, and claimed Nietzsche as a prophet of their ideology. They painted him as a champion of domination, racial hierarchy, and ruthless strength. But this was not Nietzsche. It was a distortion, crafted largely by his own sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Elisabeth was a nationalist, an anti-Semite, and a supporter of the very ideologies Nietzsche despised. After Nietzsche's mental collapse, she took control of his manuscripts, edited them selectively, and presented him as a thinker aligned with her own views. She even courted Hitler himself, giving him Nietzsche's walking stick and staging propaganda events at the Nietzsche Archive. The tragedy is that Nietzsche's philosophy could not have been further from fascism. He despised nationalism. He mocked German pride. He detested anti-Semitism, calling it a sickness. And he warned against the very herd mentality that totalitarian regimes demand. When Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, he did not mean a master race. He meant an individual who creates his own values, beyond the constraints of mass morality. When he spoke of the will to power, he did not mean political conquest. He meant the inner drive of life to expand, to overcome, to create. In fact, Nietzsche would likely have seen Nazism as the very embodiment of the herd morality he criticized, a system demanding obedience, conformity, and blind loyalty. And yet history remembers the distortion as much as the truth. The shadow of Nazi misuse still clings to Nietzsche's name. Even today, many people hear Übermensch and think of fascist propaganda rather than existential creation. This misinterpretation raises a philosophical warning of its own. Powerful ideas are dangerous, not only because of their truth, but because of how easily they can be twisted. Nietzsche's philosophy was explosive, so explosive that in the wrong hands, it became dynamite for ideology. But if we look closely, we find Nietzsche's real message is the opposite of fascism. It is a call to individuality, to creativity, to the courage to think for oneself. It is a rejection of conformity, of blind obedience, of the very instincts that fuel authoritarian regimes. So when we confront the history of Nietzsche and the Nazis, we should not only condemn the distortion, we should recognize the deeper lesson that ideas, once released, cannot be controlled. They can be misread, manipulated, abused. And this places a responsibility on us, not just to quote philosophy, but to understand it. Nietzsche never asked us to worship power for its own sake. He asked us to question power, to resist the comfort of ready-made answers, and to forge meaning where none is given. In this way, the true Nietzsche is not the philosopher of fascism, but its fiercest enemy. Some philosophers remain locked in dusty libraries. Nietzsche escaped them. His words, his provocations, his very style, aphorisms like sparks burn their way into culture. And even today, more than a century after his death, his voice echoes in places he could never have imagined. Take, for example, the name Superman. When Nietzsche described the Übermensch, English translators rendered it as Superman. Decades later, in 1938, two Jewish-American teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, created the comic book hero Superman. The connection was partly accidental, partly deliberate. The hero was not Nietzsche's philosopher, but the name stuck, and now in the minds of millions, the Übermensch is less Zarathustra's visionary, and more a man in a cape. This is one of Nietzsche's ironies. His profound ideas became household words, but often stripped of depth. God is dead is quoted in memes, in graffiti, even in rock songs, but rarely with the existential weight he intended. Nietzsche's influence stretches across literature. Writers like Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre grappled with his vision of a world without transcendent meaning. Without Nietzsche, existentialism as a movement might never have been born. His shadow lies behind Dostoevsky's characters wrestling with despair, behind Camus's absurd hero pushing his boulder uphill, behind Sartre's declaration that existence precedes essence. In music, too, his words resonate. Richard Strauss composed Also sprach Zarathustra, turning Nietzsche's philosophical poetry into one of the most iconic symphonic pieces of the 20th century. That opening fanfare, later used in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, is instantly recognizable, a cultural echo of Nietzsche's prophetic style. Nietzsche's themes of struggle, rebellion, and self-creation echo in rock and heavy metal. Bands like Black Sabbath and Metallica have referenced his aphorisms, channeling his spirit of defiance. Even pop culture catchphrases like "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger" trace back to his pen. But perhaps the most telling sign of Nietzsche's cultural impact is how often he is misunderstood. The Übermensch becomes a comic hero, will to power becomes a slogan for ambition, God is dead becomes a cynical joke. And yet this is fitting in its own way. Nietzsche wanted to unsettle, to provoke, to make us think. If his words travel far, even in distorted forms, they still spark reflection. Even when misread, they refuse to disappear. In cinema, Nietzsche's fingerprints are everywhere, from Fight Club's anarchic rejection of consumer values, to The Matrix's questioning of reality, to countless anti-heroes who refuse to bow to convention. Nietzsche's challenge to conformity and his call to self-overcoming haunt the silver screen. Philosophy, for him, was not academic decoration, it was dynamite. And dynamite, once lit, does not stay neatly contained. So when we see Nietzsche in comic books, in movies, in rock lyrics, we may smile at the irony, but we should also remember, culture often vulgarizes what it cannot digest. The true Nietzsche still waits behind the pop culture echoes, asking us not to admire superheroes, but to become creators of meaning ourselves. Imagine this. One night, as you are sitting alone, a demon whispers to you, "This life, as you now live it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more. Every pain, every joy, every thought, every breath, nothing new, nothing different, only the same life, again and again, for eternity." How would you react? Would you curse the demon and collapse in despair? Or would you embrace him, saying you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This is Nietzsche's thought experiment, the eternal recurrence. It is not a scientific theory. Nietzsche did not mean that time literally loops. It is a psychological and ethical test. If you had to live your life an infinite number of times, exactly as it is, would you love it? For Nietzsche, this question is the ultimate measure of strength. To say yes to eternal recurrence is to affirm life completely, not only its pleasures, but its pains, not only its victories, but its failures. It is to love existence so deeply that you would willingly live it over and over again, forever. Most of us hesitate. We think of our regrets, our mistakes, our suffering. To repeat them endlessly feels unbearable. But this is exactly Nietzsche's challenge. He dares us to live in such a way that we could embrace recurrence, to live a life worthy of infinite repetition. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "The greatest weight. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more,' would you not throw yourself down, and gnash your teeth, and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god'? and never have I heard anything more divine. This thought experiment forces us to confront our relationship with existence. Do we treat life as something to endure, hoping it will pass? Or do we embrace it so fully that even eternal repetition would not rob it of its worth? Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is a weapon against nihilism. If life repeats eternally, then every choice, every act, every moment gains infinite weight. Nothing is trivial, nothing disposable. Everything matters forever. It is also a call to courage, to live in such a way that if faced with the demon's whisper, you could answer, yes, again. For Nietzsche, this is the highest affirmation of life. It is not enough to endure existence. We must love it, not in spite of its suffering, but with its suffering included. This is why the eternal recurrence connects so deeply with his later idea, Amor Fati, the love of fate. So ask yourself, if the demon came tonight, what would you say? If eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's most terrifying thought, Amor Fati, the love of fate, is his most liberating. What does it mean to love fate? Not simply to endure it, not to resign ourselves like victims chained to necessity, but to affirm every moment, every joy, every pain, as something we would choose, again and again. Nietzsche writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, but to love it." This is not passive acceptance, it is active affirmation. It is not saying, I guess I must suffer this. It is saying, yes, this suffering too is mine, and I embrace it as part of the whole of life. For Nietzsche, this was the antidote to resentment. So much of human misery comes from wishing the past were different, from cursing our circumstances, from envying what we do not have. But Amor Fati asks us, what if we could transform resentment into affirmation? What if, instead of wishing away our fate, we could say yes to it? This is a radical stance. It means saying yes not only to the parts of life we like, but also to the parts we dread, to illness, to failure, to heartbreak, even to death. Not because these things are good in themselves, but because they are inseparable from the fabric of existence. To reject them would be to reject life itself. Amor Fati is the spiritual courage to say, everything that happens to me, everything I will take as if I had chosen it. Even the worst, even the hardest, is mine to affirm. Imagine how this transforms perspective. The setback is no longer an injustice, it is fuel. The pain is no longer meaningless, it is part of the path. The loss is no longer an accident, it is woven into the destiny we embrace. This does not mean passive surrender. Nietzsche did not want us to become quiet fatalists. Amor Fati is not about sitting still and saying whatever happens, happens. It is about dancing with life, even when the music turns dark. It is about shaping destiny while loving its weight. In this sense, Amor Fati is the natural companion to eternal recurrence. If life repeats infinitely, then to embrace it, we must love it wholly. And to love it wholly is Amor Fati. Nietzsche saw in this love a new kind of freedom. The freedom not to flee from suffering, not to curse necessity, but to live as if every moment, chosen or unchosen, were a gift. Amor Fati. Love your fate. Love it not because it is perfect, but because it is yours. You've been watching Lumora Mind, the channel where philosophy meets story. If you're fascinated by the thinkers who dared to reshape how we see the world, make sure to subscribe, because here, every idea is an invitation to think deeper. But before we close, let us return to the man himself, Friedrich Nietzsche. In January 1889, in the streets of Turin, Nietzsche saw a horse being beaten by its owner. Witnesses say he rushed forward, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and collapsed in tears. After this moment, he fell into silence. The fiery voice that had challenged gods and morals went quiet. He spent the final years of his life in madness, cared for by his mother, and later by his sister. The philosopher who declared the death of God ended his life in the darkness of his own mind, and yet, his words outlived him. They spread like sparks, igniting revolutions in literature, psychology, art, and politics. Nietzsche's legacy is not simple. His ideas have been twisted, misused, worshipped, and feared, but one thing is certain: they cannot be ignored. He is a thinker who forces us to confront life itself, stripped of illusions, and to ask, can we say yes to existence? And maybe that is the real measure of Nietzsche's philosophy. Not whether we agree with him, not whether we find him comforting, but whether his words make us wrestle with our own lives. Whether they push us to create meaning, to embrace struggle, to live as if we could say to the demon of eternal recurrence, yes, again. Thank you for watching. If this journey into Nietzsche's philosophy challenged you, imagine what's next. Subscribe, join Lumora Mind, and together we'll keep exploring the ideas that shape us.